Hey Dev Team, welcome back to Flutter with Drag. In this episode we're going to work a little bit more on our server because I want to, within the app, the next thing I want to do is get the profile pages and user bits working, and for that to happen we need to set it up in the backend first so we can get our data. Now in this episode I'm going to be using a new extension over here called Thunder Client. This is in VS Code. This is the extension, you can find it, and the web address, and so on and so forth for it. There's other software that does the same thing, software like Postman, but we're going to use the Thunder Client because it's embedded within VS Code and easy to use while recording. So what does Thunder Client do? Well, Thunder Client allows us to create requests to web pages and post and get data from it. So for example, if we were to create a request to http localhost and 3000/events, we can send that request, that GET request, and we should get something back. We won't right away because the server's not running. We'll get a connection refused. So let's move into our server folder and run the server. And once that's running, we can hit the same request again. I'll just wait for it to say server running. There we go. Because we're not authorized. And we get our unauthorized. So let's come into our server, into our index.ts, where we have our events, and just for now I'm going to comment out the Auth Middleware, which will take away the need for any authentication. And if we run that again after a few seconds, because it's the first time, we can see that we get our results back. Okay, so what we want to do now is do the same thing but for users. Can't get users. That makes sense because we haven't set it up. So let's do that first. And that's quite straightforward. If we come to controllers, events, I'm just going to copy and paste and rename that to users. Okay. Making sure I'm in the users directory now. Let's set this up so it's pretty much the same. If we go to /, we want to get a list of the users, and so the database collection is going to be called users instead of events. If we go to users/id, then we're going to want to get that user's ID, and if it doesn't found, we want to say user not found rather than event not found, and export this as users controller. And that's it. Simple as. So if we save that, come to our index, we just need to make it accessible now. So we're going to add it into here, and instead of events we're going to have users, and this is going to be our users controller. Let's save that. And now if we come back to our Thunder Client and do a send there, we should get a list of all our users. But it's blank. Why is it blank? Well, we haven't got any users. We haven't set any up yet. We have no collection called users. So I would expect that to come back as blank. Now, I did say at the very beginning of this series that I wasn't really going to be doing the backend. We were going to make the assumption that the user was set up already and things like that. But I am actually going to go back on that, and I am going to set it up here within our server so that users can be created. So how do we create a user using Crud? Well, to create a user, instead of getting at this endpoint, we want to post something to that endpoint. So let's just copy that line, paste it above, close that function off just to finish it up. And instead of getting, we're going to post. So if someone posts to users, because don't forget this is our users controller, so this will be prefixed with users. If someone posts to users, then this is the method that's going to get run. So what do we want to do? Well, there's two things we need to do. We need to set up the user with Firebase Auth, and then we need to store user details in the Firestore users collection. Okay, so what data do we want coming in? Well, for now we're just going to do this a slightly longer winded way, but making sure we've got everything. We're going to want an email address for the user. We're going to want, in fact I'll just make this blank for now. We're going to want a password for the user. We're going to want a display name, and we're going to want a profile. Later on we'll probably churn this and create a nice interface for it, but for now we'll leave it as this. Okay, so where do we get all these bits from? Well, they're going to come from the request, and what's going to be posted into us is going to be a HTTP post request, and the body of the HTTP is going to be a JSON object. So we're going to have a JSON object which is going to have an email address with whatever it is, with password as whatever it is, so on and so forth. Okay, and we can access all of those through this request object by putting request body and then the name of the field really that's coming in. So request body password, request body oops, not result, sorry, request body, let's call this one display name, but I'm going to put it as an underscore like that so it can be different. Oop, didn't mean to hit that button. And the profile, which is going to be the description of the user, their information about themselves. Request body profile. So we have those bits of data coming in. So how does that look in our Thunder client here? Well, instead of a GET request, it's going to be a POST request. And as you can see, we can use all of these different things, but this is a POST request. And the body is going to be JSON, and we can set that up. So we're going to have email. Of course, it's coming in as JSON, so we need to put it in brackets. So user1@test.com. Password is going to be password 123. The display name, which is going to be like that, is going to be user1 name. We'll do that for now. And the profile is going to be the description. This is the profile for user 1. Okay, so that's what's going to get sent to our users as a post. Great, so then what do we do with that? Well, first of all, we need to check we've got all that data. So I'm going to say here, if not email, or not password, or not display name. I'm going to say that all of this is required or not profile. And we could be much more sophisticated with our checking of the data here, but I'm going to keep it simple for now. Either it exists and it doesn't, and we're going to trust our user to get it right. It's always a bad idea to trust your users, but there we go. We're going to return a result with a status code of 422, and we'll send back an error message, and the error we'll send back will be missing data. Okay, so let's save that. Let's come back to our request and let's take out the password field for a second, just as a test, and send that. Okay, and we've got a load of errors. Okay, and the error is that we can't read property email of undefined. Well, that's happened because the request by itself hasn't yet, the JSON hasn't appeared in the request. We need to run some more middleware to ensure that happens. And we can do that very simply by putting app use, and we can put express JSON. Now you used to have to install additional packages for this, but now it's included with express. So we'll save that. Server is running again. Let's run that request. And now we've got our error message saying error missing data, because it knows the password is missing. Let's result here send OK, and let's test that it gets that far. So let's put our password back in. Password 123. And now if we send that, we have all the data, so we should get the response OK. Fabulous. But we don't want the response OK. We want it to do all this. So first of all, we want to set up the user with our Firebase Auth. So we're going to do that, and we're going to await our admin. We've already got our admin there, auth, create user. This is a Firebase function here. Create user needs a user record, and that will take in an email, a password, and a display name. Like that. Now, if you're not familiar with what I've just done here, doing this is exactly the same as that. Okay, when you're creating an object in JavaScript, if the variable that you're creating is the same as the object property name, then you don't need to put it all in like that. You can just put in the name. If display name was called display name, I don't know, ABC, then this create user is expecting a display name. We would have to put in display name ABC because our variable doesn't match that. And that's fine, that works, that's no problem. But if it's the same, then you don't need to do that. Just saves a little bit of writing. Okay, so this create user is going to return a promise with a user record. So we're going to get that back. So let's save that into variable. So our user is going to result or wait for the result of that. And we want that because we need to know the user ID that is created. Firebase will create a user ID for us, and pass us back that user object, and that user object will have the ID in it. So when we come to store the data in the collection, we can then say await db collection. We're storing it in the users collection. We're storing it in a doc, and the document ID, if we left that blank, would be a random ID, but we want the document ID here to be the same as the user ID. So we can do that with user UID. Okay, and we want to create that new document. And the fields in the document we want the name. We want to store a field called name, and that's going to be the display name. We want to store the profile, so we'll store the profile. And I also want to store a field for when this record was created and when it was updated. So it's going to be created at admin firestore field value dot server timestamp, and that will basically take the timestamp that the server's on and save that as in the created. And I want to do the same for updated. Now at the moment they'll both be the same, but in future if we're just updating something, for example a user's profile image or the profile itself or the display name, then updated will change. The created will never change. That will be fixed. Whatever it is now is what it will remain at, because it can only be created the once. Okay. And so again you can see here I've only put profile in because the field name is the same as the variable name I'm saving, whereas the display name, I want the field there to be called name, so I'm having to specify the field name and then the variable. And finally I want to return to our server, or from the server, the JSON, and we're going to have a message user created, and I'm also going to send back the UID, which is going to be the user's UID, and we'll save that. So let's come to our request and send it again, and we've got our message back saying user created, and we've got a user ID JSS. So let's flip across to our Firebase console, come to our authentication, and we can see that indeed we have our user one that was created, and we've got the user ID. And if we come to our Firestore database, where the users collection didn't exist before, so you can see even the collection's been created for us, we have a document which has the same ID, and we have all the bits of information that we've saved. So we have the date it was created and updated, which is the same. We have the username, or the name of the user, and the profile. Great, so that's all working. So coming back to our request now, let's change this back to a get, and before I do that I'm just going to copy the user ID we've got there. So let's change that to a get, and we're going to get the users, and I should now get a list of all the users, and there we have. Okay, we've got our user one coming back, and this here doesn't look like the date, the formatted date, because it's a Firestore timestamp. We'd have to do some more processing to actually get that into a date time format. I'm not worried about that just yet. And if we paste in, that wasn't it, I thought I'd copied that. If we paste in after the users the ID and send, instead of getting an array, you can see here we've got an array because we're in the square brackets, I should just get the one user. And there we have it. Now you might ask why, when we went to users, did we only get one user when we've got two users? If you remember from our auth, we've already got dry.here.com set up. Well, the answer is we haven't got any database entry for that user because it was set up manually before. And this is only returning the database stuff. So to fix that, we would have to manually add drag to the database. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to come back to our Firestore, to our authentication. I'm just going to copy the UID for drag@test.com. Come back to the Firestore users, add that document, paste in the UID, and we have to put the same fields in. So we've got name, drag, we have the profile. This is my profile. We've got a created at, which is going to be wrong. We don't know when it was created, but we'll just put sometime, doesn't matter. And we've got an updated, which is also going to be a timestamp, which we'll also put today, and save. Okay, so we've got that user now as well. So coming back to our requests, if we hit send again, we now get our two users. We now get our user 1 and we get our drag. Fabulous. But now we have the next issue is I don't want everybody to be able to add users. In fact, I only want a very small group of people to be able to add users. I want maybe administrators of the event to add users and also private web services. So we need to do something with our authentication to make this a lot more secure. So coming back to this, if we come to our request, well, one of the other ways we could authenticate this, because this here isn't logged in as a user, is we could send a key, which is something that is private and isn't available. And if you send the correct key, it then knows you're an administrator. So I'm going to choose a very secure and cryptic key, let me in. You could choose something a bit more secure than that yourself. So if that key comes either as part of the body or as a query parameter, if either of those happen, then we know that the user is coming from a trusted bit of software, a bit of device. This is a low tech secure way, but it's not too bad. How do we do that within our authentication middleware? Let's put our authentication back, and this time I'm going to move my auth back up to the top here, so even before the slash. Okay, so at the moment as it stands, even this needs you to be authenticated. Let's come to our Auth middleware and look at this. So at the moment, when we try and decode our token, if there is no token, or if the token's not valid, we basically kick you out at that point and say you're unauthorized. Well, I'm going to change that and allow it still to go through. Okay, so all that's going to happen is if there is a token and it's valid, then the user ID is going to be decoded and saved as part of the request. And if there is no token or it's not valid, then the user ID is going to be set to null. And now I also want to see whether our admin key works. So just at the top, I'm going to set a constant with that in. Better still, it should be set as an environmental variable rather than sort of hard-coded into the code. We'll fix that at another time. So the admin key is going to be equal to let me in. Okay, super secure. And so now down here we can say if the request query key equals admin key, or if the request body key equals admin key. Okay, so either it's part of the body, sorry, this part, either it's part of the body or it's part of the query string. If either of those, we're going to set our request.admin to equal that. So if either of those are true, request.admin is going to equal true. Otherwise, it's going to be false. Now, this is underlined again. We can fix that by coming to our types before, and like we added in UID before, we can add in admin, which is going to be a Boolean. Okay, so now our request object has this admin, can have this admin thing on it, and it's going to equal true or false. Every time Auth Middleware is called, admin is going to equal true or false. So coming back to our index, we're first of all running it through the JSON parser. So now we know our body is sorted, and then we're running it through the Auth Middleware. And so by this point, okay, the user will have, or the request will have a user ID and an admin. The user ID might be null if it's not a valid user, or it might have a valid key. So let's test that just here. Let's console.log the user, which is going to be the request ID, and admin. Capitalize that. Okay, let's come back to our request and just go to our slash there, and it's down here we're looking, not really the result of it. But if we now send it, we are getting hello, and we can see that the user is null, but the admin is true. If we take the key out of the body and send it, we can see that the admin is false now. And if we add it to a query parameter and send it, we can see again that it's true. And if it's not exactly what we're expecting, it's false. So now within our code, we know if the user is valid or not. Okay, but now we've got the next problem, that if we go to /events, for example, we get a list of events, and we only want that to be accessible by people who are authenticated. So what we need to do in our Auth Middleware is write some code. And we're going to write a new method, a new function here called require auth. And that we can just copy this bit up here, is going to work out whether we are authenticated or not. It's not going to be asynchronous. So what we can say here is if the request UID, so if that exists, they are authenticated, or if request admin So if the admin is true, they're also authenticated. And if that's the case, we're just going to go on to the next middleware. If it's not the case, we're going to return right now the result status 401 send unauthorized. Okay, so where do we want to put that? Well, we want anything to do with our events, because at the moment our events are just listing them. We want anything to do with our events to be only accessible if the user is authorized. So we can put that right here, and we can put, okay, first of all, just need to make sure we export it. So I'm going to export it and then come back to here and put in require auth. And this is one of the beauties about middleware, is you can chain it. So when we come to events, it's going to run it through the require auth first of all. And if that fails, it's not going to go any further. But because we've got the next, we're calling the next function in it, basically that means we'll go on to the next thing. And so it goes on to the event controller. So if we save that and come back to our request, we haven't got key anywhere here. So if we send that, we should get unauthorized. However, if we add our key in and send it, we now get our results back. Okay, fabulous. We're getting somewhere. So what about our users? Well, again, we don't want the users accessing it unless they are authorized. So let's close that off immediately. Okay, then we want to be able to post to the / to create a user. Well, we only want admin to be able to do that. So let's come back to our auth, and I'm just going to copy this entire require, make sure I get the right one, require auth function. And this time I'm going to change it to require admin. And this time I'm not worried about the user ID. We only want to worry about an admin. So if we're an admin, we'll send you on to the next. Otherwise, we'll send unauthorized. And we could leave the message like that, but I'm going to add in a bit extra so we know which unauthorized we're getting back. Admin required. Okay, let's export that function, required admin. Come back to our users, and for our post, again, we can chain things here. So I'm going to put in require admin just there and save that. So now when we get to the post, when we go to users / straightforward thing, first of all we require the user to be auth. That is already being checked. And then we're going to require the admin. And then if we get past that, we're going to run the code. So let's come back to our request. I'm going to delete the key from up there. I'm going to create a new user. So user2 name. This is the profile for user2. It's going to be a post, and this should fail. Let's send it. Unauthorized. Well, it's actually failed because we're not, it's actually failed because we're not authorized at all. We're not a user or an admin. But even if a user was logged in, it would also fail at this point. However, we can put a hidden field in here. I'll explain what I meant by that in a second. let me in and send that. Let's send that to the right URL to users, send, and there we are, we have our new user created. And then if we just get from the users, we should get all 3 of our users. So far, so good. So now we can post and we can get the user details, and we might suggest that actually for getting, we only want admin to be able to get as well. But we will worry about that permissions after, if we're going to do that or not. But what about for updating the user? Well, we're not going to write all the code for that just now. Make sure I'm in the users directory. But it's going to be similar to this. If we're updating a user, we're going to be passing a user ID. So I'm just going to copy that and close the brackets off. And instead of a get, it's going to be a patch request. Okay, so if you're changing something, you're patching it. Now, what we want to do here is, there will be some code that we're going to have to do later on. For now, I'm just going to result send OK, just so we know that that's worked. So let's come to our request and change this to a patch request. Let's pick the ID for user 2. I'm just going to copy it and paste it. Okay, and I'm going to click send, and we get OK because we're admin. But I don't just want anybody to be able to update this, or just admin. I also want the ability for the user to be able to update their own stuff. That makes sense. If you edit your profile, you need to update your profile. So within the auth, I'm going to create one final thing, which is going to be require self. Okay, and again, I'll just copy and paste that. So what's require self going to do? What we're going to say here is if required UID equals triple equals, because it's a comparison and it needs to be identical, the request params ID, or if it's an admin, if either of those are true, next. Else, we're going to change that, authorize, copy and paste. You can only edit yourself. Something like that. Okay, so coming back to our users, so if we get a patch request, oh, hang on a sec, I didn't export it. Let's just export that, require self, come back to our users, and we'll patch that through there, required self. So for this patch request, you need to be yourself, and so the ID is coming from there. So if the ID that you're putting in, so if that ID matches the ID that's stored within your token, or if you're an admin, then we're going to allow that request. Otherwise, we're not. And I can't test that until we're back into Flutter. But obviously there's got to be more code in here because we need to build the patch request. We need to be able to update the document. So that, folks, is that. Now we have our ability to be able to create users only if we're an admin. We have the ability to list users, and we have the ability to list a specific user, which is going to be important for the next episode when we create the profile pages. And we're going to be able to send a patch request to patch the user. And that will be done in the next episode. So folks, if you've enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. It does help me out. And we'll leave it there, and we'll see you in the next episode. Until then, stay safe, take care, bye now.